Frank Richardson's weathered hands froze mid-reach as Grace's agonized roar split the Texas dawn. The massive lioness writhed in the dirt, her swollen belly contracting violently, while King, her protective mate, stood guard with hackles raised and golden eyes blazing with territorial fury. This wasn't supposed to happen for another 2 weeks. Sarah Beth's coffee mug shattered against the concrete as she bolted from the office, her scream piercing the morning air. "Dr. Collins! Emergency in Enclosure 7!" Tommy Blackwood burst from his trailer, still pulling on his boots, his face draining of color as he witnessed the scene unfolding before them. Frank's chest tightened, not from his failing heart but from recognition. Grace's desperate eyes held the same terror he'd seen in his wife's face during that final, terrible night 5 years ago when everything went wrong. "Get back from that fence!" Tommy shouted, but Frank was already moving toward the enclosure gate. What drove a 72-year-old man to risk everything for a dying lioness? And why did Grace's pain feel like his own unhealed wounds tearing open again? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Serengeti Hope Ranch had been Frank Richardson's last refuge from a world that had taken everything he loved. The 500-acre sanctuary sprawled across East Texas hill country, its weathered fences and sun-bleached barns housing 47 rescued exotic animals from failed circuses and bankrupt roadside zoos. Now, with foreclosure papers scattered across Dr. Margaret Collins' desk like autumn leaves, the ranch faced extinction in 48 hours unless someone could produce $280,000. Frank had seen plenty of last stands during his 30 years as an Army veterinarian, but nothing quite like this. At 72, with a Purple Heart gathering dust in his trailer and a pension that barely covered his heart medication, he'd thought his fighting days were over. The drunk driver who killed his wife Margaret and son Michael 5 years ago had taken more than just their lives. He'd stolen Frank's reason for getting up each morning. Until Grace arrived. Sarah Beth Martinez understood desperation intimately. At 45, the head veterinary nurse worked 3 jobs to keep her daughter Emma at Harvard, sending every spare dollar north while surviving on coffee and determination. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as she checked animal medications, but her mind stayed fixed on the tuition bill waiting at home. $50,000 might as well have been $50 million. Dr. Margaret Maggie Collins had built Serengeti Hope from nothing, transforming her late husband's cattle ranch into a sanctuary that gave broken animals second chances. At 68, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years making life-or-death decisions. But lately, words escaped her mid-sentence, and she'd find herself standing in rooms with no memory of why she'd come. The early stages of Alzheimer's crept through her mind like fog, making the financial crisis feel even more insurmountable. Tommy Blackwood presented the ranch's greatest contradiction. The 50-year-old manager had arrived 3 years ago with impeccable references and an unexplained hatred for what he called throwing good money after bad animals. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of honest work, but his eyes held secrets that made the others uncomfortable. Frank especially seemed to trigger something in Tommy, a resentment that went deeper than professional disagreement. The ranch itself told stories of hope and heartbreak in every corner. Enclosure 7 housed King and the lioness who would soon arrive, its reinforced barriers built to contain 800 pounds of apex predator while allowing visitors to witness majesty up close. The main barn doubled as a veterinary clinic, its concrete floors stained with the evidence of countless medical procedures performed with more love than proper equipment. When the transport truck rumbled through the gates that September morning, carrying a pregnant lioness named Grace, None of them realized they were about to discover that some bonds transcend species, that family isn't always defined by blood, and that sometimes salvation comes with 4 legs and a broken heart ready to trust again. The transport truck's diesel engine coughed to silence as Grace's crate emerged into the harsh Texas sunlight. Frank Richardson had seen plenty of broken animals during his decades as a veterinarian, but something about the lioness's amber eyes stopped him cold. She wasn't just malnourished and pregnant. She was haunted, carrying the same hollow look he recognized in his own mirror every morning. "Wild Bill's safari went belly up last week," the driver explained, sliding paperwork across his clipboard. "Owner skipped town, left all the animals behind. This one's been refusing food for 3 days. Grace's ribs showed through her golden coat, and her swollen belly made her movement awkward as she paced the narrow confines of her traveling prison. Tommy Blackwood crossed his arms, scowling at the sight. "We can't afford another mouth to feed, especially one that's about to become 2 or 3 mouths." His voice carried an edge that made Frank's jaw tighten. "Maggie, this is financial suicide. We're 48 hours from losing everything." But Frank wasn't listening to Tommy's protests. He approached Grace's crate slowly, the way he'd learned to move around traumatized animals during his army years. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his weathered voice carrying decades of gentleness. "You're safe now." Grace stopped pacing. Her massive head turned toward Frank, and for a moment that stretched longer than physics allowed. Predator and human studied each other. Then she did something that made Sarah Beth gasp. She chuffed, a sound of recognition that lions reserve for family members. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Frank whispered. "She knows me." The financial bombshell exploded during the emergency staff meeting that evening. Dr. Collins spread the foreclosure papers across the conference table like tarot cards predicting doom. "Insurance companies are refusing to cover exotic animal incidents anymore," she explained, her voice shaking slightly. "The Williams family sued us into the ground after their grandson got too close to the tiger enclosure last year." Sarah Beth's face went pale. "How much do we need?" $280,000 by Friday morning, or the bank takes everything." Maggie's hands trembled as she removed her reading glasses. "I've called every donor, every foundation. Nobody's willing to take the risk anymore." Frank studied the numbers with the same intensity he'd once used to read battlefield casualty reports. His entire pension amounted to $14,400 annually, barely enough to keep him in heart medication and canned soup. But watching Grace's trusting eyes had awakened something he thought had died with his family. "Take my pension," he said quietly. "All of it." Tommy slammed his coffee mug down hard enough to crack the handle. "Frank, you're talking about your survival money. What happens when your heart condition gets worse?" "These animals got nowhere else to go," Frank replied, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once commanded respect in military field hospitals. "Sometimes a man's got to choose what's worth dying for." That night, Frank found himself drawn to Grace's enclosure like iron filings to a magnet. She lay in the far corner, her breathing labored, occasionally shifting position as the cubs moved within her. King, the massive male lion in the adjacent enclosure, watched Frank's approach with surprising tolerance. "You remind me of someone," Frank whispered through the chain-link fence. Grace's ears perked up at his voice, and she struggled to her feet, approaching with careful steps. "My boy Michael. He had a stuffed lion just about your color. Carried that thing everywhere until the day he—" Frank's voice cracked. He hadn't spoken Michael's name aloud in 2 years. Grace pressed her massive head against the fence as close to Frank as the barriers would allow. Her rumbling purr vibrated through the metal links, and Frank found himself reaching out to touch her forehead through the gaps. "You've been someone's baby before, haven't you?" Frank realized. "That's why you're not afraid." Meanwhile, Sarah Beth discovered something that made her hands shake as she rifled through old ranch records in Maggie's office. Buried in a stack of transfer papers from 3 years ago was a familiar name. Richardson Exotic Animal Rescue, Liquidation Sale. The document listed various animals sold to private collectors, including Grace, African lioness, 3 years old, hand-raised from cub. Michael Richardson had owned an exotic animal rescue operation. Frank's son had raised Grace from infancy. That's why she trusted Frank with the instant recognition of family. That's why she'd approached him without fear, why King tolerated his presence, why she'd chuffed at the sound of his voice. Grace wasn't just another rescue animal. She was a living connection to the son Frank had lost, a bridge between his shattered past and an uncertain future. But telling Frank the truth might destroy him completely, or it might give him reason to keep fighting. Sarah Beth clutched the documents to her chest, torn between protecting Frank from more heartbreak and honoring his right to know that somewhere in Grace's feline memory lived the loving touch of Michael's hands. 2 days before foreclosure, Grace's labored breathing woke Frank from his restless sleep in the trailer. He'd been keeping vigil outside her enclosure since midnight, dozing fitfully in an old lawn chair with his jacket pulled tight against the October chill. Something was wrong. The rhythm of her breathing had changed, becoming shallow and urgent. "Sarah Beth!" Frank called into his radio, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. "Get down to enclosure 7. Grace is in distress." Dr. Collins arrived first, her silver hair disheveled and her medical bag clutched in trembling hands. One look at Grace confirmed Frank's fears. The lioness lay on her side, her massive body rigid with premature contractions, amber eyes wide with pain and confusion. "She's going into labor," Maggie announced, her veterinary training overriding the fog that increasingly clouded her thoughts. "At least 2 weeks early." "The cubs are positioned wrong. Breech presentation, possibly entangled." She looked up at Frank with the gravity of someone delivering a death sentence. "Without immediate surgical intervention, we'll lose them all." Tommy arrived as Sarah Beth was setting up emergency lighting around the enclosure. His face hardened when he saw the gathered medical supplies, the IV bags, the surgical instruments that represented thousands of dollars the ranch didn't have. "Absolutely not," Tommy declared, stepping between Frank and the enclosure gate. "We are not spending our last $15,000 on a veterinary procedure that might not even work." Frank's weathered face flushed with anger. "That's a living creature in there suffering. We don't get to play God with her life just because we're broke." "We play God every day in this business," Tommy shot back. "Every time we decide which animals to feed first when supplies run low, every time we choose which medical treatments we can afford. That's the reality, Frank. We can't save everyone." Sarah Beth watched the confrontation escalate, the transfer papers still burning in her pocket like a guilty secret. She knew why Frank felt such a desperate connection to Grace, but revealing the truth now might send him into cardiac arrest. His face was already flushed with the exertion of arguing, his breathing becoming labored. "How would you know about making those kinds of choices?" Frank demanded, stepping closer to Tommy. "You've been here 3 years. I've been making life and death decisions since before you could spell veterinarian." Tommy's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Just like your father, always choosing animals over—" He caught himself, but the words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged gun. Frank went perfectly still. "What did you just say?" "Nothing." "I meant people like your father. Veterinarians. People who—" "How would you know anything about my father?" Frank's voice had dropped to a whisper, the kind of quiet that preceded either violence or heartbreak. "I never told you about him." Tommy's face went pale. In his anger, he'd revealed knowledge he shouldn't possess. Sarah Beth noticed the telltale signs, the way Tommy's hands shook, how he couldn't meet Frank's eyes, the guilty flush creeping up his neck. I just assumed. Most vets have family in the profession." But Frank wasn't buying it. 72 years of reading people, of surviving war zones and emergency rooms and the worst moments of human experience, had taught him to recognize deception. "You know something. About my family. About me." Grace's agonized roar cut through their confrontation like a blade. She was deteriorating rapidly, her body convulsing with contractions that brought no relief. King paced frantically in the adjacent enclosure, his deep-throated calls growing more desperate. Dr. Collins tried to refocus their attention. "We need to make a decision now. I can attempt a cesarean section with the equipment we have, but it's extremely dangerous. One wrong move and we lose Grace instantly. The nearest emergency veterinary hospital is 2 hours away," Sarah Beth added quietly. "She'll never survive the transport." Frank looked from Grace's suffering form to Tommy's guilt-stricken face, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. The timing of Tommy's arrival at the ranch 3 years ago, his inexplicable knowledge of Frank's personal history, the way he sometimes looked at Frank with an expression that seemed almost paternal. "Sarah Beth," Frank said slowly, never taking his eyes off Tommy, "call the emergency vet anyway. Tell them we're bringing Grace in." "Frank, she won't make it," Maggie protested. "Then I'll deliver those cubs myself, right here, right now." Frank's voice carried the same quiet determination that had gotten him through 3 tours of duty and countless battlefield surgeries. "I've been delivering calves since I was 16. Anatomy's anatomy." Tommy grabbed Frank's arm. "You're not licensed for surgery anymore. Your hands shake. Your heart—" "My heart's just fine when I'm saving something that matters." Frank shook off Tommy's grip. "And since when do you care about my health? You've been fighting me on every decision since the day you got here." The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Tommy's mouth opened and closed without sound, and for a moment Sarah Beth thought he might confess whatever secret he was carrying. Instead, he turned and stalked toward his trailer. "Where are you going?" Frank called after him. Tommy paused at the edge of the circle of light, his shoulders sagging with the weight of unspoken truths. "To get something. Something that might help Grace. And something that's going to change everything you think you know about your family." As Tommy disappeared into the darkness, Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. Grace's labored breathing filled the silence, each exhale possibly her last. In his pocket, his cell phone buzzed with a text from the bank. "Final notice. Payment due. 8 a.m. Friday or foreclosure proceedings begin immediately." Friday was 18 hours away. Grace might not survive the next 18 minutes. And somewhere in the darkness, Tommy was retrieving secrets that would either save them all or destroy what little family Frank had left. Tommy returned carrying a weathered wooden box that looked like it had survived decades of careful handling. His hands trembled as he set it down near Grace's enclosure, and Frank noticed tears streaming down the younger man's face, tears that seemed to carry 30 years of accumulated guilt. "Before I open this," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to know that everything I'm about to tell you I've wanted to say for 3 decades. Your mother made me promise never to contact you, never to interfere with your life. But watching you risk everything for that lioness, it's exactly what I would have done." Frank's blood pressure spiked as understanding began to dawn. "Tommy, what are you—" "I'm your father, Frank." The words exploded from Tommy like shrapnel from a grenade. "Thomas Blackwood, Sr. I left when you were 3 years old because I was a coward, a drunk, and your mother deserved better than watching me destroy everything I touched." The world tilted sideways. Frank gripped the fence post to keep from falling as 30 years of carefully constructed identity crumbled around him. "That's impossible. My father died when I was 5. Mama told me—" Your mama told you what she needed to tell you to protect you from the truth. Tommy opened the wooden box with reverent hands. Inside lay dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, and official documents. I never died, son. I just disappeared. Into a bottle first, then into guilt, then into a new life where I couldn't hurt anyone anymore. Sarah Beth watched the revelation unfold with growing horror. Frank's face had gone chalk white, his breathing shallow and erratic. She recognized the signs of an impending cardiac episode and moved closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the emergency radio. Tommy pulled out a faded photograph. A young man in military fatigues holding a toddler with Frank's unmistakable green eyes. I followed your military career from a distance, saved every article about your Purple Heart, your veterinary achievements, your wedding announcement. When Margaret and Michael died, I wanted to come to the funeral, but I had no right. You had every right. Frank's voice cracked with 3 decades of suppressed anger. I needed you. When I was 8 and got pneumonia, when I graduated high school, when I got married, when my son was born, where were you? Trying to become worthy of being in your life again. Tommy's voice broke. I got sober, built a business, learned animal management because I knew it was your passion. When Dr. Collins posted that job opening 3 years ago, I applied because I thought maybe I could help you without you knowing who I was. Grace's labored breathing intensified, her contractions coming every 90 seconds now. Dr. Collins checked her watch anxiously. Gentlemen, we need to make medical decisions immediately. Grace is running out of time. But Frank couldn't process medical decisions while his entire life history was being rewritten. 3 years, he whispered. You've been here 3 years, watching me, and you never said anything? What was I supposed to say? Hello, son. I'm the father who abandoned you, but I've been secretly working at your sanctuary. I thought if I could just help keep this place running, maybe that would be enough. Maybe I could finally do something right. Sarah Beth's radio crackled with an incoming call from Emma at Harvard. Mom, I saw the news about the ranch. The GoFundMe is up to $40,000, but we need more. What's happening with Grace? The mention of Emma triggered another revelation in Sarah Beth's racing mind. She pulled out the transfer papers she'd been carrying, her hands shaking as she approached Frank. There's something else you need to know. About Grace. About why she trusts you. Frank's already fragile emotional state couldn't handle another shock. Sarah Beth, please, not now. It has to be now. She held out the documents. Grace came from Richardson Exotic Animal Rescue, Michael's facility. She's been looking for you because she remembers you, Frank. You held her as a cub. The paper fluttered from Frank's nerveless fingers as the final piece clicked into place. Grace hadn't bonded with him because of some mystical connection. She remembered him from her earliest memories, when Michael would bring her to the house as a 3-month-old cub. Frank used to bottle feed her while Michael cleaned her enclosure, used to scratch behind her ears while she purred like an oversized house cat. Michael saved her from a breeding mill when she was 8 weeks old, Sarah Beth continued gently. The papers show she lived at your son's facility for 3 years before the liquidation sale. Tommy stepped closer, his voice thick with remorse. Frank, I bought Grace at that liquidation sale. I knew she came from Michael's place, and I thought maybe bringing her here would somehow honor his memory. You knew? Frank's voice was dangerously quiet. You've known all along that Grace was Michael's lion, and you've been fighting me about helping her? I was scared, Tommy admitted. Scared that if you found out the truth about Grace, you'd also find out the truth about me. I was protecting my secret, and it almost cost Grace her life. Grace's roar of pain cut through their family drama like a knife. Her contractions were now constant, her breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. King had begun throwing himself against the fence separating him from Grace, his desperate roars echoing across the ranch. "Doctor." Collins made the executive decision they couldn't. "Frank, I'm starting the procedure, with or without permission, with or without money, with or without proper facilities. That lioness is dying, and I took an oath to do no harm." Frank snapped back to the immediate crisis, his veterinary training overriding his emotional turmoil. "Sarah Beth, get the portable ultrasound. Tommy, Dad, whatever I'm supposed to call you now, I need you to help me get the surgical lights positioned." Tommy's face crumpled at hearing Frank call him Dad, even in anger. "Frank, I know you hate me." "I don't hate you," Frank interrupted, his hands already moving with practiced efficiency to prepare the makeshift surgical site. "I'm furious, I'm hurt, and I feel like my entire life has been a lie. But Grace needs both of us right now, and she's Michael's lion. That makes her family." Working together felt strange and natural at the same time. Tommy's hands were steadier than Frank's, his movements precise and confident. Frank found himself remembering muscle memory from childhood, helping a tall man with calloused hands deliver a difficult calf, feeling proud when the man praised his careful handling of surgical instruments. "You taught me this?" Frank realized aloud as they positioned the surgical lights. "When I was little before you left. You taught me how to help animals give birth." Tommy's voice was thick with emotion. "You were 3 years old, standing on a milk crate so you could reach the table. You asked me why we had to help when animals had been giving birth without people for thousands of years. What did you tell me? I told you that just because something can happen naturally doesn't mean we shouldn't help when we can. That being able to help makes us responsible for helping." Dr. Collins had managed to sedate Grace lightly, enough to reduce her stress without endangering the cubs. The lioness lay still except for the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing, trusting these humans with her most vulnerable moment. Frank's phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Saw your story on the news. My daughter has cerebral palsy and loves lions. Sending $500. Save Grace for all the broken children who need to see that different doesn't mean hopeless." Then another. "My father was a veterinarian in Korea. He would have done the same thing. $200 from the Morrison family." And another. "Lost my son in Afghanistan. He loved animals. $1,000 in his memory." Sarah Beth watched the donations roll in on the GoFundMe page, her eyes widening. "Frank, we're up to $90,000. People are sharing Grace's story faster than we can count the donations." But Frank wasn't thinking about money anymore. His hands moved with the precision of decades of experience as he made the first incision, Tommy assisting with the skill of someone who understood animal anatomy intimately. Grace's cubs were indeed entangled, their umbilical cords wrapped around each other in a way that could have killed them both. "Almost there," Frank murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd used with countless animals over the years. "Come on, babies. Let's get you into this world safely." The first cub emerged silent and still, its tiny body motionless in Frank's hands. For a horrible moment he thought they were too late. Then Tommy cleared the cub's airway with gentle efficiency, and a tiny cry filled the night air. "One down," Dr. Collins announced. Heart rate steady, breathing established. The second cub proved more difficult, its position requiring delicate maneuvering to avoid injury. Frank's hands shook slightly, whether from his heart condition or the emotional upheaval of the evening, he couldn't tell. Tommy steadied his son's hands with his own, and together they guided the second cub into the world. This one was smaller, weaker, with an obviously twisted spine that would affect its mobility for life. But it was alive, crying with surprising strength for something so damaged. "Two cubs," Frank whispered, cradling the disabled infant with infinite gentleness. "Both alive, both perfect in their own way." As Grace began to recover from the light sedation, Frank placed both cubs near her head so she could smell them, recognize them as her own. The first cub, strong and golden, immediately began nuzzling toward warmth, but the second, the damaged one, lay still except for its labored breathing. Grace lifted her massive head and sniffed both cubs carefully. She licked the healthy one, encouraging it toward her milk. But when she smelled the disabled cub, something primal and heartbreaking happened. She turned away, rejecting the infant that nature told her would not survive. Frank felt his heart break all over again. "She won't take the disabled one," he said quietly. "It's natural behavior. In the wild, a lioness can't afford to waste energy on offspring that won't survive." Tommy reached for the rejected cub with gentle hands. "Then we'll raise her ourselves, all of us, as a family." The word family hung in the air between them, complicated, painful, but somehow still precious after all these years of separation and secrets. The disabled cub's labored breathing filled the pre-dawn silence as Frank cradled her against his chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat flutter like a trapped bird. Grace had recovered from the sedation enough to nurse her healthy cub, but she continued to turn away from the smaller one, following instincts older than human compassion. "We need to get her to a proper veterinary hospital," Dr. Collins said, her voice strained with exhaustion. "This little one needs immediate care. Oxygen therapy, proper examination, maybe surgery if her spine can be stabilized." Tommy checked his watch. 4:47 a.m. "Nearest animal hospital with exotic capabilities is in Dallas. 3-hour drive minimum, and they'll want payment up front for emergency surgery on a lion cub." Frank's chest tightened as he calculated the impossible mathematics of hope. Even with the GoFundMe donations climbing steadily, they were still short of what the ranch needed to survive, let alone fund major surgery for a disabled lion cub. But looking down at the tiny creature in his arms, he saw Michael's face, the same determination to fight against impossible odds, the same refusal to give up on something just because it was broken. "Sarah Beth, call Dallas Animal Emergency. Tell them we're coming." Frank's voice carried the authority of someone who'd made similar life-or-death decisions in field hospitals under enemy fire. "Tommy, get the transport cage ready. Maggie, I need you to call every contact you have and find us a veterinary specialist who'll work with us on payment." King's behavior in the adjacent enclosure had grown increasingly agitated throughout the night. The massive male lion paced constantly, his deep-throated calls growing more desperate as he watched Grace nurse one cub while ignoring the other. Male lions typically showed little interest in newborn cubs, often seeing them as competition for the female's attention. But as Frank approached the fence with the disabled cub, something extraordinary happened. King stopped pacing and approached the barrier, his massive head tilted with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. When Frank held the cub close to the fence, King made a sound Frank had never heard from a male lion, a gentle, chuffing noise usually reserved for lionesses greeting their young. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Frank whispered. "He's trying to communicate with her." Dr. Collins adjusted her glasses, studying King's unprecedented behavior. "In 30 years of working with big cats, I've never seen a male lion show parental interest in newborn cubs, especially disabled ones. This is scientifically remarkable." The cub responded to King's calls with tiny mewing sounds, turning her head toward his voice despite her obvious weakness. Tommy watched the interaction with growing amazement. "It's like he knows she needs extra protection." Frank's radio crackled with Emma's voice from Harvard. "Mom, the story's gone viral. CNN wants to interview you about Grace and the cubs, and the GoFundMe just hit $150,000. Her voice broke with excitement. "People are calling Grace's baby Hope, the little lion who's teaching the world that different doesn't mean worthless." Hope. The name settled over the disabled cub like a blessing. Frank looked down at the tiny creature in his arms, seeing not just damaged spine and uncertain future, but the embodiment of everything the ranch represented: second chances, unconditional love, and the belief that every life had value. Tommy's phone rang, jarring them from the moment. He answered with his usual gruff "Blackwood," but his face transformed as he listened. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I understand." "Thank you." He hung up and turned to the group, his expression unreadable. "That was Linda's lawyer, my wife's lawyer." His voice carried a weight that made everyone stop what they were doing. Apparently, Linda's will contained provisions I wasn't aware of. Secret provisions that her attorney was instructed to reveal only under specific circumstances. Frank felt another bombshell approaching. "What kind of provisions?" "Linda left a trust fund. $500,000. Tommy's voice cracked. "She knew about you, Frank. Knew you were my son. She made me promise before she died that if I ever found the courage to reconnect with you, her money should go toward whatever you cared about most." The words hit Frank like physical blows. Not only had Tommy been keeping their relationship secret, but Linda, a woman Frank had never met, had been planning for this moment from beyond the grave. "She researched you," Tommy continued, pulling out a letter from his jacket pocket. "After her cancer diagnosis, she spent months learning about your military service, your veterinary work, your family. She said any son of mine would probably be stubborn enough to choose animals over his own welfare, and she wanted to make sure you had the resources to be properly stubborn." Sarah Beth's eyes filled with tears as she listened to the posthumous generosity of a woman she'd never met. 500,000 would save the ranch and fund Hope's medical care. "There's one condition," Tommy added quietly. "The money can only be used for animal welfare and medical care. Nothing administrative, nothing that doesn't directly benefit the animals." He looked at Frank with decades of regret in his eyes. "Linda said if you were anything like me, you'd probably try to refuse help, so she made it legally impossible for you to turn down." Dr. Collins checked Hope's vital signs again, her face grave. "Her breathing is becoming more labored. We need to make a decision about Dallas soon." Frank looked around at the people who had somehow become his family over the past few hours. Sarah Beth, whose medical skills and fierce loyalty had held them together. Dr. Collins, whose wisdom and experience guided them through impossible decisions. And Tommy, the father whose abandonment had shaped Frank's entire life, but whose return might save it. "We take Hope to Dallas," Frank decided. "All of us. We make sure she gets the best care possible, and we use Linda's money to turn this ranch into something that honors both her memory and Michael's vision." As they prepared for the journey to Dallas, Grace made a sound that stopped everyone in their tracks. She was calling to Hope, a low rumbling noise that seemed to carry maternal recognition. When Sarah Beth brought Hope closer to Grace's enclosure, the lioness sniffed her rejected cub carefully, then did something that made Dr. Collins gasp. She began grooming Hope with gentle licks, accepting her disabled offspring back into her care. "The bonding process isn't always immediate," Dr. Collins explained, her voice filled with wonder. "Sometimes mothers need time to process that their offspring is different but still viable. Grace is telling us she's ready to fight for Hope now." King's response was equally remarkable. As Grace began caring for Hope, the massive male positioned himself protectively between his family and the humans, but without aggression, more like a guardian than a threat. His behavior suggested an understanding that these particular humans were helping, not harming. The transport to Dallas became a convoy of hope. Frank rode in the ambulance with Hope, monitoring her breathing and keeping her warm against his chest. Tommy drove Dr. Collins and Sarah Beth in his truck, while a police escort helped them navigate through early morning traffic at speeds that would normally be impossible. And during the drive, Frank found himself talking to Hope the way he used to talk to Michael when his son was fighting childhood illnesses. "You're tougher than you look, little girl. Got that fighting spirit from your mama, and she got it from surviving whatever hell she went through before coming to us." Hope's breathing remained steady throughout the trip, as if she understood that help was coming. Frank marveled at her resilience, born with disadvantages that would have killed her in the wild, but surrounded by humans determined to give her every possible chance. Tommy called ahead to Dallas Animal Emergency, using Linda's name and the promise of immediate payment to secure their best exotic animal specialist. "Dr. Jennifer Walsh," he told Frank over the radio. 30 years of experience with big cats, pioneered several spinal surgery techniques for large mammals. The Dallas skyline appeared on the horizon as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold that reminded Frank of Grace's eyes. In his arms, Hope stirred slightly, her tiny paws flexing as if reaching for something only she could see. "Almost there, sweetheart," Frank whispered. Almost there. Behind them, King's roars echoed across the ranch they'd left behind, calling to his displaced family. Grace answered from her recovery enclosure, a sound that carried across miles and promised that some bonds were strong enough to survive any separation. The adventure was far from over, but for the first time in 5 years, Frank Richardson felt like he was fighting for something worth winning. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's examination of Hope revealed the cruel mathematics of spinal injury in newborn lions. The tiny cub's vertebrae had been compressed during the difficult birth, creating a condition that would require immediate surgery or result in complete paralysis within hours. As Frank held Hope on the sterile examination table, watching her struggle to move her hind legs, he felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions settling on his shoulders. "The surgery is experimental," Dr. Walsh explained, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd delivered similar news countless times. "We'd be inserting titanium rods to stabilize her spine, followed by months of physical therapy. Even if everything goes perfectly, she'll never be a normal lion. She'll need constant care, specialized equipment, and there's no guarantee she'll ever walk properly." Tommy stepped forward, Linda's inheritance papers clutched in his weathered hands. "What are the odds of success?" 30% chance of significant improvement, 60% chance of partial mobility, 10% chance the surgery kills her. Dr. Walsh's honesty was brutal but necessary. "The procedure will cost $87,000, not including post-operative care and rehabilitation." Frank looked down at Hope, who had managed to lift her tiny head and was trying to nurse from the bottle Sarah Beth held. Her amber eyes, so like Grace's, so like Michael's old stuffed lion, held a determination that seemed impossibly large for such a small body. "She wants to fight," Frank said quietly. "Look at her. She's not giving up." Dr. Collins, who had remained silent during the consultation, suddenly spoke up. "Frank, I need to tell you something about the ranch, about why this decision matters more than just Hope's life." The words came out in a rush, as if her deteriorating memory was racing against time to deliver crucial information. "The ranch isn't just facing foreclosure because of debt. The county has been looking for an excuse to shut us down for years. Too many insurance claims, too many complaints from neighbors about noise and smell. If we lose Hope, if this surgery fails and generates negative publicity, they'll use it as justification to rezone our land for development." Frank felt the walls closing in from every direction. Not only was Hope's life hanging in the balance, but the future of every animal at Serengeti Hope Ranch depended on a surgery with 30% odds of success. Sarah Beth's phone buzzed with another update from Emma. The stories reached international news. BBC, Reuters, animal rights groups are all watching what happens to Hope. Some are calling it animal cruelty to attempt surgery on a lion cub. Others are saying it's our moral obligation to try. Tommy read the growing criticism on social media, his face darkening with each comment. "Half the people are calling us heroes for trying to save her. The other half are calling us selfish for putting her through unnecessary suffering." He looked up at Frank with eyes that held 30 years of regret. "Just like when I had to decide whether to stay and fight for our family or leave to protect you from my mistakes." The parallel hit Frank like a physical blow. Hope represented the same impossible choice that had torn his family apart decades ago. Was love sometimes about letting go, or was it about fighting even when the odds were hopeless? Dr. Walsh interrupted their family drama with clinical urgency. "I need a decision within the next hour. Hope's condition is deteriorating. If we're going to attempt surgery, it has to be now." Frank closed his eyes, trying to channel the wisdom that had gotten him through battlefield medicine and veterinary emergencies. But this felt different. This wasn't just about saving one animal. It was about honoring Michael's memory, healing his relationship with Tommy, and proving that some things were worth fighting for even when success seemed impossible. "What would Michael do?" Frank asked aloud, the question directed more to himself than anyone else. Sarah Beth answered softly. "Michael saved Grace when she was 8 weeks old, and everyone said she was too wild to be rehabilitated. He spent 2 years proving them wrong." Tommy added, "Michael called me once about 6 months before the accident. Said he was working with a lion cub that had been abused by previous owners. Told me that sometimes the most damaged animals become the strongest fighters because they know what it means to survive against the odds." The memory hit Frank like lightning. He remembered that phone call, Michael describing a golden lion cub who'd been rescued from a roadside zoo, how she'd initially been afraid of humans but gradually learned to trust again. Grace. Michael had been talking about Grace. He saved her once, Frank realized. My son saved Hope's mother when everyone else had given up. Now it's my turn to save Hope. Dr. Walsh nodded grimly and began preparing for surgery. "I'll need you to sign consent forms acknowledging the risks, and I'll need payment authorization before we begin." As Tommy handled the financial arrangements using Linda's inheritance, Frank found himself alone with Hope for a few minutes. The tiny cub was fighting to stay conscious, her breathing shallow but determined. Frank placed his hand gently on her small head, feeling the warmth of life flickering like a candle in the wind. "Your mama trusted me once, when she was about your size," Frank whispered. "Michael helped her learn that not all humans want to hurt her. Now I'm asking you to trust me the same way. I know it's scary, and I know it hurts, but we're going to fight for you, like Michael fought for your mama." Hope's tiny paw moved slightly, pressing against Frank's palm in what might have been coincidence or might have been recognition. Frank chose to believe it was recognition. The surgery began at 2:17 p.m. on what was supposed to be the day Serengeti Hope Ranch lost everything to foreclosure. Instead, Frank found himself in a surgical observation room, watching Dr. Walsh and her team work with precision that reminded him of military field hospitals. Tommy sat beside him, both men united in vigil for a creature that represented their last chance at redemption. "I'm sorry," Tommy said quietly, not taking his eyes off the surgical monitors. "For leaving, for staying away, for letting you think I was dead." Frank's response surprised them both. "I'm sorry too. For judging you before I knew the whole story, for assuming the worst instead of hoping for the best." He paused, watching Hope's vital signs fluctuate on the monitors. Maybe that's what hope is teaching us, that fighting for something matters more than the odds of winning. The surgery stretched into the evening, with updates coming every hour. Titanium rods inserted successfully, spinal alignment achieved, blood loss minimal. Each positive report felt like a small miracle, building toward something larger than medical success. At 8:43 p.m., Dr. Walsh emerged from surgery with exhaustion written across her face, but hope shining in her eyes. The procedure was successful. Hope is stable, and her spinal cord shows no signs of permanent damage. She'll need months of rehabilitation, but there's real reason for optimism. Frank felt 30 years of grief and guilt begin to transform into something resembling peace. Hope would live. The ranch would survive. And somewhere in the midst of saving a disabled lion cub, he'd found his father again. But the biggest surprises were still waiting. 3 days after Hope's surgery, Frank received a phone call that shattered everything he thought he understood about family, loss, and the intricate connections that bind lives together across decades. He was sitting in Hope's recovery room at Dallas Animal Emergency, watching the tiny lion cub take her first tentative steps with the help of a specially designed mobility harness, when Sarah Beth's trembling voice came through his cell phone. "Frank, you need to sit down. I've been researching family records, trying to understand all these connections, and I found something impossible." Her voice carried the weight of someone about to deliver life-altering news. "Emma isn't just my daughter. She's your great-niece." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He gripped the arm of his chair, watching Hope struggle to coordinate her movements, and tried to process what Sarah Beth was telling him. "That's impossible." "You said Emma's father died in a construction accident when she was 2. "He did. But his name was David Richardson, your brother Robert's son." Sarah Beth's voice broke. "I never knew David had family. He was estranged from everyone, had been since he was 18. When he died, I was so overwhelmed with grief and single motherhood that I never researched his background." Frank's mind reeled as the implications cascaded through his consciousness. Emma, the brilliant young woman at Harvard whose tuition had been weighing on Sarah Beth's heart, was his own blood, Michael's cousin, the granddaughter Frank never knew he had. "There's more," Sarah Beth continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I found David's birth certificate, and it lists something else. Tommy Blackwood as the emergency contact. Frank, Tommy knew David. He's known about Emma all along." The betrayal cut deeper than Frank's original anger about Tommy's abandonment. Not only had his father hidden their relationship for 3 years, but he'd also known about Emma's connection to the family and said nothing while watching Sarah Beth struggle financially. Frank's hands shook as he ended the call and immediately dialed Tommy's number. When his father answered, Frank's voice was dangerously quiet. "We need to talk. Now. About Emma. About David. About how many more secrets you've been keeping while I've been believing we were building something honest." Tommy's silence stretched long enough for Frank to hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally, his father's voice came through, heavy with decades of accumulated guilt. "I'll be there in 2 hours. And Frank, bring Emma's medical records. There's something about her scholarship to Harvard that you need to know." The drive back to the ranch felt like descending into a family nightmare that kept revealing new layers of deception and connection. Emma had driven down from Cambridge when the story went viral, ostensibly to help with the fundraising efforts and document Hope's recovery for her journalism class. But now Frank wondered if her presence was part of some larger pattern he'd been too blind to see. Emma was waiting in the ranch office when Frank and Tommy arrived, her laptop surrounded by financial documents and family trees she'd been piecing together with the methodical precision of someone trained in investigative research. At 19, she possessed Sarah Beth's determined spirit, but carried herself with an intellectual confidence that reminded Frank achingly of Michael at that age. "Grandfather," she said to Tommy, using the title with careful neutrality, "I think it's time we all stop pretending we don't know what's happening here." Tommy's face went pale. "Emma, how long have you—" Known that you were paying my Harvard tuition through a fake scholarship fund. About 6 months. Known that Mom's late husband was your grandson. I figured that out yesterday when I started researching the family connections for my article about hope. Emma's voice carried no accusation, just the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who'd learned to navigate adult complications far too young. The question is why everyone's been lying to each other when we're obviously family. Frank sank into a chair, feeling like his entire understanding of the past 5 years was collapsing. Tommy, you've been paying for Emma's education? Linda's money, Tommy admitted quietly. She set up the scholarship fund before she died, specifically for family members pursuing veterinary medicine or related fields. Emma's pre-med with a focus on veterinary research. She qualified legitimately. But you knew, Frank pressed. You knew she was David's daughter, which makes her my great-niece, and you've been watching Sarah Beth work 3 jobs to pay for school while you had the money to help. Emma interrupted before Tommy could respond. He wasn't supposed to tell anyone. The scholarship came with a confidentiality clause. If Mom had known it was family money, she would have refused it. She looked at her mother with gentle understanding. You know you would have, Mom. Your pride would never have let you accept help from family you didn't know existed. Sarah Beth, who had been silent since their arrival, finally spoke. Emma, you've known for 6 months that Tommy was your great-grandfather and you didn't tell me? I was trying to protect you the same way he was trying to protect Frank. Everyone in this family seems to think that keeping secrets is the same thing as showing love. Emma's observation cut through the emotional chaos with uncomfortable accuracy. But watching Uncle Frank risk everything for hope made me realize that maybe love is actually about fighting for each other, not protecting each other from the truth. The word uncle hit Frank like a sledgehammer. He looked at Emma, really looked at her, and saw Michael's stubborn chin, his own green eyes, and something indefinable that spoke of shared genetic heritage. This brilliant, determined young woman was his family, had been his family all along while he'd been mourning the end of his bloodline. Dr. Collins arrived as the family revelations were reaching their emotional peak, her memory clear enough in the moment to recognize the significance of what she was witnessing. Frank, there's something else you need to know about Linda's will. Something Tommy hasn't told you yet. Tommy's shoulders sagged with the weight of carrying too many secrets for too long. Maggie, please. No more secrets, Dr. Collins said firmly. Linda didn't just leave money for the ranch and Emma's education. She left specific instructions for what should happen if Frank ever learned the truth about his family connections. She pulled out a sealed envelope that looked like it had been waiting for this moment for years. Linda wrote this letter specifically for Frank, to be opened only after all the family relationships were revealed. She wanted to make sure that when the truth came out, it came with an explanation of her hopes for what this family could become. Frank's hands trembled as he opened the letter, written in the careful script of someone who knew she was racing against time. The words on the page seemed to glow with posthumous wisdom. Dear Frank, if you're reading this, it means Tommy finally found the courage to tell you who he is, and fate brought your family together through your shared love of animals. I never met you, but I watched my husband carry the grief of losing you for 27 years. He told me about your military service, your veterinary work, your dedication to saving things others had given up on. Those are the qualities I fell in love with in Tommy, and I recognize them in the stories he told about his son. I'm leaving money not just for the animals you'll save, but for the family you'll build. Emma is brilliant and kind and destined to continue your legacy of healing. Sarah Beth has the strength to love you through your stubborn periods and the wisdom to call you on your nonsense. Tommy has spent 30 years learning to be worthy of your forgiveness, even if he doesn't think he deserves it. Hope, and yes, I'm confident there will be a hope by the time you read this, represents what this family does best. We save the broken things. We fight for the lives others consider hopeless. We love unconditionally, even when love seems impossible. The ranch can become more than a sanctuary for animals. It can become a place where broken families learn to heal together, where children like Emma see that different doesn't mean worthless, where men like Tommy discover that it's never too late to choose love over fear. All my love to the family I never met but always believed in, Linda Blackwood. The letter fell from Frank's nerveless fingers as the full scope of Linda's vision became clear. She hadn't just left them money. She'd orchestrated a reunion that brought together 4 generations of a family that had been scattered by fear, pride, and misconceptions about love. Emma broke the emotional silence. So what happens now? Do we keep pretending we're not family, or do we figure out how to make this work? Frank looked around at the faces surrounding him. Tommy, carrying 30 years of regret and hope. Sarah Beth, whose love had been complicated by secrets but remained genuine. Emma, whose sharp intelligence was tempered by a wisdom beyond her years. And Dr. Collins, whose deteriorating memory somehow held the pieces that made everything else make sense. "We make it work," Frank said quietly. "All of it. The ranch, the family, Hope's recovery, Emma's education. We make it work because that's what families do. We fight for each other, even when the odds are impossible." But even as Frank spoke the words, he knew their hardest challenges were still ahead. Hope's recovery was far from guaranteed. The ranch still faced regulatory scrutiny, and learning to be a family after decades of separation would test every commitment they were making. The biggest surprises, however, were yet to come. 6 months later, Frank Richardson stood at the edge of Hope's enclosure, watching something that veterinary science said was impossible. The young lioness, now weighing 60 pounds and sporting a custom-designed mobility harness that supported her partially paralyzed hindquarters, was teaching a group of children from the Dallas Children's Hospital how to be brave. Her twisted spine and unsteady gait had become symbols of resilience rather than disability, and her gentle interactions with visitors had transformed Serengeti Hope Ranch into something Linda Blackwood had envisioned but never lived to see. "Uncle Frank, you need to see this," Emma called from the observation deck, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd discovered something remarkable. She was home for spring break from Harvard, where her pre-veterinary studies had taken on new focus since discovering her family's calling. "Hope just did something incredible with the Patterson boy." Frank climbed the wooden steps to where Emma stood filming with her phone, documenting Hope's interactions for the therapeutic program that had evolved from desperate necessity into groundbreaking animal-assisted therapy. Below them, 8-year-old Marcus Patterson, born with spina bifida and confined to a wheelchair, was feeding Hope through the protective barrier while Tommy narrated the lioness's adaptive behaviors. "See how Hope positions herself?" Tommy explained to the small group of children and their parents. "She knows Marcus can't stand up, so she's lying down to make eye contact with him. That's not trained behavior, that's empathy. She understands what it means to navigate the world differently." Marcus's face glowed with wonder as Hope approached the fence, moving with her characteristic rolling gait that somehow conveyed both strength and vulnerability. "She walks like me," Marcus whispered to his mother. "Different, but she's still the strongest animal here." Sarah Beth approached with Hope's afternoon medication, now serving as the ranch's director of therapeutic programs, a role that had evolved naturally from her nursing background and her intimate understanding of what it meant to fight for family against impossible odds. At 46, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling after years of simply surviving. "The waiting list for therapeutic visits is now 18 months long," she reported to Frank, her voice mixing pride with the practical concerns of managing success. "We've got requests from children's hospitals in 12 states, and the University of Texas wants to study Hope's behavioral patterns for their animal psychology program. Frank nodded, but his attention was caught by something happening near the main gate. A convoy of vehicles was approaching, not the usual mix of family cars and school buses that brought therapeutic visitors, but official-looking sedans and a news van that suggested this visit was different. Tommy jogged up from Hope's enclosure, his 73-year-old frame moving with the urgency of someone who'd learned to recognize potential trouble. "Frank, we've got incoming VIPs, Texas Parks and Wildlife, county commissioners, and what looks like a film crew." Dr. Collins emerged from the main office, her steps careful but determined. Her Alzheimer's symptoms had stabilized over the past 6 months, as if having a clear purpose had slowed the disease's progression. She carried a folder thick with official documents and wore the expression of someone preparing for battle. "They're here about Hope," she announced grimly. "The state's been getting pressure from animal rights groups who claim we're exploiting a disabled wild animal for publicity. They want to evaluate whether Hope should be transferred to a traditional zoo facility." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. After everything they'd built, everything Hope had overcome, the possibility of losing her to bureaucratic interference felt like a betrayal of Linda's vision and Michael's memory. Emma's journalistic instincts kicked in immediately. What's their legal standing? Hope was born in captivity. She's never known the wild, and she's providing documented therapeutic benefits to disabled children. They can't just take her. They can if they determine that our facility doesn't meet state standards for housing large carnivores, Dr. Collins replied. The good news is that Linda's inheritance allowed us to exceed every safety and care requirement. The challenging news is that politics doesn't always follow logic. The lead official, a stern woman in her 50s wearing a Texas Parks and Wildlife uniform, introduced herself as Director Patricia Hoffman. Her inspection team included a veterinarian, an animal behaviorist, and a representative from the county zoning board who'd been looking for reasons to shut down the ranch for years. "Mr. Richardson," Director Hoffman began, her tone professionally neutral, "we're here to evaluate claims that you're keeping a disabled lion in conditions that may not serve her best interests. We've received reports that the animal is being used for public display despite medical conditions that would normally require specialized care in a research facility." Frank felt 30 years of military bearing straighten his spine. "Ma'am, with respect, Hope receives better medical care here than she would at most research facilities. She has daily physical therapy, custom equipment designed specifically for her needs, and social interaction with both humans and other lions that promotes her psychological well-being." The veterinarian on the inspection team, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, stepped forward with professional curiosity rather than suspicion. "I'd like to observe Hope's interactions with both the other lions and the therapeutic visitors. The reports we've received suggest some unusual behavioral patterns that could be significant for our understanding of animal cognition and empathy." What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations and would later be cited in veterinary journals as unprecedented in the study of big cat behavior. As the inspection team approached Hope's enclosure, King emerged from the adjacent area where he'd been resting in the afternoon shade. The massive male lion, now weighing over 400 pounds, positioned himself protectively near Hope, but showed no aggression toward the visitors. Instead, King began what could only be described as a demonstration. He moved slowly around Hope, allowing the officials to observe how he'd adapted his behavior to accommodate her mobility limitations. When Hope struggled to navigate a small incline in their enclosure, King positioned himself as a physical support, letting her lean against his massive frame for balance. "Extraordinary," Dr. Martinez whispered, her professional composure cracking with amazement. "Male lions don't exhibit protective behavior toward disabled pride members. In the wild, King would either ignore Hope or, more likely drive her away as a burden to the group. Tommy approached the fence with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 years studying these animals' daily behaviors. King started protecting Hope before she was even born. During Grace's difficult labor, he allowed Frank to approach and help with the birth. Since Hope's surgery, he's never left her side for more than a few hours. Emma had been filming the entire interaction, capturing footage that would later become part of a documentary about interspecies empathy and adaptive behavior. Director Hoffman, you should also see how Hope interacts with our therapeutic visitors. Her response to disabled children suggests cognitive understanding that goes beyond simple training. Marcus Patterson, still visiting with his family, called out from his wheelchair, "Miss Hope, show them you're walking." Hope responded to Marcus's voice by approaching the section of fence where he waited, her mobility harness glinting in the afternoon sunlight. She moved with deliberate care, demonstrating the adaptive gait she'd developed to compensate for her spinal limitations. But more remarkably, she positioned herself at Marcus's eye level and made soft, chuffing sounds that seemed designed to communicate reassurance. Director Hoffman watched the interaction with growing amazement. How long has she been responding to specific children like this? Sarah Beth consulted her therapeutic program notes. Hope began showing preferential responses to disabled visitors about 2 months after her surgery. She seems to recognize children with mobility aids or medical equipment and adjusts her behavior accordingly. It's not trained. We've never taught her to distinguish between different types of visitors. The county zoning representative, a man named Bill Crawford, who'd been anticipating an opportunity to cite violations, found himself instead witnessing something that challenged his assumptions about both animals and the ranch's impact on the community. "How many children have you served through this program?" 237 in the past 6 months, Frank replied. Average stay is 3 hours, with some families returning monthly. We've documented improvements in mood, social interaction, and treatment compliance among children who participate in Hope's program. Dr. Martinez was taking extensive notes, her initial skepticism transforming into scientific fascination. "Mr. Richardson, would you be willing to participate in a formal study of Hope's therapeutic interactions? What you're describing could revolutionize our understanding of animal-assisted therapy for disabled populations." The inspection that had begun as a potential threat to Hope's future was evolving into validation of everything the ranch represented. Director Hoffman requested a complete tour of the facilities, observing not just Hope, but the other animals whose rescue stories had become part of the ranch's identity. As they walked past enclosures housing tigers rescued from roadside zoos, bears saved from bile farms, and wolves recovering from illegal captivity, Frank found himself telling the story of how Serengeti Hope Ranch had transformed from Linda Blackwood's vision into a model for ethical animal rescue and therapeutic intervention. "The remarkable thing," Emma added as they concluded the tour, "is that none of this was planned." Hope's birth complications, Frank's connection to Grace through Michael's facility, even Tommy's relationship with Frank, it all came together because everyone involved chose to fight for something they believed in, even when the odds seemed impossible. Director Hoffman consulted with her team privately before delivering her official assessment. When they reconvened near Hope's enclosure, her expression had transformed from bureaucratic suspicion to genuine admiration. "Mr. Richardson, after today's evaluation, Texas Parks and Wildlife is prepared to officially designate Serengeti Hope Ranch as a model facility for therapeutic animal interaction. Hope's care exceeds every standard we could require, and the benefits to your human visitors are clearly documented." She paused, watching Hope interact with King near their shared water source. "More importantly, Hope is demonstrating behaviors that suggest she's not just surviving her disabilities. She's thriving because of the purpose they've given her. The news crew that had accompanied the inspection team captured footage that would later air on national television, turning Hope's story into a symbol of resilience that reached far beyond the Texas Hill Country. But for Frank, the real victory was simpler and more personal. Watching his great-niece Emma document Hope's progress, seeing Sarah Beth coordinate with medical professionals who wanted to study their therapeutic model, and working alongside Tommy to build something that honored both Linda's memory and Michael's vision. As the sun set over the ranch that evening, 4 generations of the Richardson-Blackwood family gathered near Hope's enclosure for their daily reflection, a tradition that had evolved naturally from their shared commitment to the animals in their care. Frank looked around at the faces illuminated by the golden Texas sunset and realized that Linda had been right about everything. They had indeed saved the broken things, fought for lives others considered hopeless, and learned to love unconditionally despite decades of separation and secrets. Hope approached the fence where they stood, moving with her characteristic determination, and Frank understood that some miracles take time to reveal their full scope. Sometimes the family you choose has 4 legs and a heart brave enough to trust again. At 72, Frank Richardson thought his story was ending. A widowed veteran surviving on memories and medications, watching his Purple Heart gather dust, while his heart slowly failed. But Grace, a rescued lioness carrying her own wounds from an abandoned past, taught him that love doesn't diminish when shared. It multiplies like candlelight in darkness. When Frank risked everything to save Grace's disabled cub, Hope, he discovered that his estranged father, Tommy, had been secretly watching over him for 30 years, that his young colleague, Sarah Beth, was actually family, and that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our most impossible challenges. Hope's twisted spine became her superpower, teaching disabled children that different doesn't mean worthless, while King's unprecedented devotion to his disabled offspring showed the world that love transcends every boundary we think we understand. Frank's ranch transformed from a failing sanctuary into a beacon of healing where broken hearts learn to trust again, where grandchildren find grandfathers they never knew existed, and where hope literally has 4 legs and refuses to give up. Because the best chapters of our lives often begin when we think the story is over. Have you ever discovered that what seemed like your greatest loss was actually preparing you for your most important purpose? What impossible situation in your life turned out to be the doorway to something beautiful you never could have imagined? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Frank Richardson woke on Christmas morning to the sound of children's laughter echoing across Serengeti Hope Ranch, a sound that would have seemed impossible just 1 year ago when foreclosure papers had covered his kitchen table like autumn leaves. At 73, with his heart condition stabilized by purpose rather than medication alone, he moved through his morning routine with the careful gratitude of someone who'd learned that miracles often came disguised as disasters. Hope, now a year old and weighing nearly 90 pounds, had learned to navigate her world with a grace that defied every medical prediction. Her custom mobility harness, designed by engineering students from the University of Texas, allowed her to move with dignity while accommodating the spinal limitations that had once threatened her life. But more than her physical progress, Hope's emotional intelligence had become the cornerstone of a therapeutic program that was reshaping how medical professionals understood the healing power of interspecies connection. "Merry Christmas, Uncle Frank," Emma called from the main office where she was coordinating the arrival of 23 families whose children would spend Christmas Day with the animals. At 20, she carried herself with the confident competence of someone who'd found her calling early, combining her pre-veterinary studies at Harvard with hands-on experience that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Sarah Beth emerged from the veterinary clinic carrying medical charts and wearing the peaceful expression of someone whose life had finally aligned with her deepest values. At 47, she discovered that love could bloom at any age when built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Her engagement ring, a simple band that had belonged to Linda Blackwood, caught the morning sunlight as she checked on the animals who'd become extended family. "Tommy's already down with Hope and the Christmas visitors," she reported, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd learned to trust happiness again. "That man's 74 years old and has more energy than volunteers half his age." Frank smiled at the mention of his father, whose transformation over the past year had been as remarkable as Hope's recovery. Tommy had thrown himself into ranch operations with the dedicated intensity of someone making up for lost time, his guilt gradually transforming into purposeful action that honored both Linda's memory and his commitment to rebuilding their family. The Christmas visitors were part of a pilot program that had evolved from Hope's natural affinity for children facing medical challenges. Families from across Texas brought their children to spend holidays with animals who understood something about overcoming limitations. The program had generated waiting lists that stretched into the following year and research opportunities that attracted veterinary behaviorists from around the world. Dr. Collins appeared from her cottage, moving slowly but with clear purpose. Her Alzheimer's progression had stabilized remarkably over the past year, as if having a meaningful role in Hope's story had given her mind something worth fighting to preserve. She carried a wrapped package that Frank recognized as the annual Christmas tradition she'd established for Hope. "Every rescue animal deserves Christmas presents," she announced with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years making such declarations. "Hope's gift this year is special, a puzzle feeder designed to challenge her problem-solving abilities while accommodating her physical limitations." The sound of vehicles approaching announced the arrival of the day's most important visitors. Frank watched a familiar van pull through the gates, followed by cars carrying families whose children had been transformed by their interactions with Hope. Leading the group was Marcus Patterson, now 9 years old and serving as an unofficial ambassador for the therapeutic program. Marcus navigated his wheelchair with practiced efficiency toward Hope's enclosure, where the lioness was already positioning herself for their reunion. Over the past year, their relationship had developed into something that veterinary literature struggled to categorize, a bond between a disabled child and a disabled lion that seemed to transcend species barriers and communicate healing in ways that traditional therapy couldn't replicate. "Miss Hope," Marcus called, his voice carrying across the ranch with excitement that made every adult present smile. "I brought you Christmas treats, and I want to show you my new leg braces." Hope's response was immediate and remarkable. She approached the protective barrier with her characteristic rolling gait, positioned herself at Marcus's eye level, and made the soft chuffing sounds that had become her signature greeting for special visitors. King, ever protective, maintained his position nearby, but showed no concern about the children gathering around his family's enclosure. Frank found himself standing beside Tommy, both men watching the interaction with the wonder of people who'd witnessed daily miracles for a year, but still found each moment remarkable. "Linda would have loved this," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying the bittersweet joy of someone who'd learned to honor memory while embracing present happiness. "She did love this," Frank replied, gesturing toward the scene before them. "Every bit of this was her vision. We just had to learn to trust it." Emma was documenting the Christmas interactions for the documentary that would premiere in February, her journalism skills capturing not just the obvious heartwarming moments, but the subtle therapeutic breakthroughs that occurred when disabled children saw Hope navigate her world with confidence and joy. Sarah Beth joined them with coffee and the morning's donation reports. "The Christmas fundraising campaign exceeded every target," she announced. enough to fund the new therapeutic facility and establish the scholarship program for children whose families can't afford travel expenses for visits. The new facility represented the next phase of Linda's vision, a dedicated space where children could spend extended time with Hope and other therapy animals, complete with accessible accommodations for families and research capabilities for studying animal-assisted healing. Construction would begin in the spring, funded entirely by donations from people who'd been touched by Hope's story. Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived from Dallas with her annual Christmas visit, combining social celebration with medical evaluation of Hope's continued progress. Her pioneering surgery had been featured in veterinary journals worldwide, but she'd maintained a personal connection to Hope that went beyond professional achievement. "Remarkable as always," Dr. Walsh announced after observing Hope's interactions with the visiting children. "Her mobility continues to improve, but more importantly, her social behaviors suggest cognitive development that we're only beginning to understand. Hope isn't just surviving her disabilities, she's using them as tools for connecting with others who face similar challenges." The Christmas celebration continued throughout the day, with families sharing meals prepared in the ranch's community kitchen while children rotated through supervised interactions with Hope and other animals. Frank found himself moving through the festivities with the grateful awareness of someone who'd learned that the best chapters of life often began when you thought the story was ending. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Frank gathered with his family, biological and chosen, near Hope's enclosure for their daily reflection. Emma sat beside him, editing footage on her laptop while simultaneously engaging with the children. Sarah Beth leaned against his shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd learned to love each other slowly and deliberately. Tommy stood nearby, his presence a daily reminder that forgiveness was possible even after decades of separation. Hope approached their gathering place with King beside her, both lions moving with the unhurried confidence of animals who knew they were safe and loved. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold that reminded Frank of the first morning he'd seen Grace, pregnant and desperate, trusting him with her most vulnerable moment. "You know what I realized today?" Frank said, his voice carrying the reflective tone that had become characteristic of their evening gatherings. "We kept calling this place a rescue ranch, but I think we had it backwards. These animals didn't need rescuing, we did. Grace rescued me from loneliness, Hope rescued us all from thinking our stories were over, and King rescued our understanding of what family really means." Emma looked up from her laptop with the satisfied expression of someone who'd captured something important. "That's perfect, Uncle Frank. That's exactly how the documentary should end." As Christmas Day drew to a close and the visiting families began their journeys home, Frank Richardson stood in the place that had become his greatest achievement and deepest joy. At 73, with his heart strong enough to love a family he'd never expected to find, he understood that some gifts take a lifetime to unwrap fully. Hope settled near the fence for her evening rest, her amber eyes reflecting the last light of Christmas Day. In those eyes, Frank saw not just the miracle of her survival, but the larger miracle of a family reborn through shared purpose, unconditional love, and the unshakable belief that every life, human or animal, perfect or flawed, had immeasurable worth. The ranch that had nearly been lost to foreclosure had become a beacon of healing where broken hearts learned to trust again, where children discovered that different didn't mean worthless, and where love proved stronger than every limitation that tried to define it. And in the gentle Texas evening, with his family surrounding him and Hope's contented purr filling the air, Frank Richardson knew that the best was yet to come.